morning. It's good to have more of a congregation here this morning. It's good. Preaching maybe not quite so different, but for singing, it is nice to be able to be together and to worship God together. We can do that in our homes. We can do it online. That's good, but there's something wonderful about being able to connect together. We are continuing on in 1 Peter chapter 5. I had set my goal at the beginning of the week that I was going to finish off the whole chapter, and I just found so much good stuff in there that I decided that I'd better do half of what was left and save some for next week as well. So that's kind of the plan for this morning. I titled our topic for this morning about being a potluck. A potluck is one of my favorite kinds of meals. It's the neat thing about it is that there's a lot of different flavors and foods together. It's not a planned out kind of meal where it's all kind of organized and structured and sits together in a function in a category like that. But I have often said over the years that one of the favorite jobs of being a pastor is saying prayers at potlucks. That's just one of the most joyful things I have. And I guess my love of food and fellowship, and it just seems like the start of a really wonderful time when you can do a potluck. And it's good to do that. There's a good time to have a fancy meal and organize over Christmas, and we build a meal together around a key thing and add things, and my wife will even make sure, get colors in there, so you have the right kind of colors so when it sits on your plate, it fits nice. There's something nice to all that. But there's also something nice to just taking some of your favorites and putting them together and enjoying them. And when we get to the New Testament, very often the book is organized up on a theme. And our theme this morning, we just passed by, is about the suffering and being patient and persevering in suffering times in 1 Peter. That's kind of the theme. But and he organizes up the whole chapter around this whole thing, the whole book. And then at the end, he's got a few more things that he would like to add that aren't necessarily tied to the first original main thought, but they're good things, and he wants you to make sure that you get them. And so this morning we're going to look at 4 of these topics. And this is what Peter has done. He's kind of added in these little short ones at the end. And they deal with some of the things that we should deal with. And so I've called this a bit of a potluck sermon. And here you have them. The 4 topics that we're covering through this morning is about obsession, submission, humility, anxiety, and the devil. And we start with submission. In a lot of ways, this ties together. This is the connecting into. He does link these together. It's related to the chapter that we talked about last week about leadership. Leadership in the church, about how we need to be shepherds. That's what we need for leadership above all other things. And related to talking about the leaders, he returns and talks about the people who are the followers. If we're talking about shepherds, then he's now coming back and talking just a little bit about the sheep. And it's not really a surprise to us that the theme that he's come through many times in 1 Peter is about the idea that we should submit to authority, that we should submit to governing authorities, chapter 2, and that we should follow the government of the day. And it's been a challenge. We've gone through a year and a half of COVID, and a big chunk of what that is all about is that every 3 weeks or so, we get new updated rules about how we need to live our lives. And so we've gone through the stage of having masks in and being socially distanced, and then and then back and forth, and they keep on changing. And the commitment to Peter has here is that we should choose to submit. And it's interesting because now the guidance is a little bit more towards, if you're healthy, come to church. If you're feeling good, then you can go on, because apparently we're not going to kick this thing. It's not going to go away. And to a certain degree, apparently, we're going to have to put up with COVID. And so it's a perspective, again, it was a little stranger for me this week as I was listening in on that. But whether we always have agreed or thought that the government's suggestions were the best ones, we've tried to follow the guidelines as best we can. And then now this week we are divided as a church. Just kind of teasing at the beginning, the north side had basically all the people on it, and I was sitting all by myself, outnumbered. And then eventually Cheryl came by, so then the north side doubled, but we were still outnumbered. And then Kendall and Debbie came and joined us with their family, and we doubled again. So now we're almost catching up to the same size. But we're divided. We don't really like being divided, but we are committed to following through this idea of submitting. So we talked about government following, and then he expanded. He talked about in marriages, we need to submit to each other. In workplaces, we need to find a way to work with and be submissive to our workplaces. And and all these different areas of life. And so it shouldn't really come as a surprise to us that when he comes around to how do you deal with leadership in the church, how should you respond to it, that he comes back to the same thing. You should learn how to submit to church authorities in much the same way. Leadership is something that Jesus has said is important. We need leaders in the church, and that as a church, we need to find pastors, we need to find leaders in our church, and try to find ways to follow them. It's easy sometimes to look for ways why we shouldn't follow, but the guidance here from Peter is that we should try to find ways to work with that. It's unfortunate, but the suffering that we've had tends to bring out the worst of leaders and also the worst in followers. And it's important for us to choose to work together, and that we as leaders, kind of the challenge from last week, to walk and be shepherds and be humble. And now we as followers, if we on both sides work together like this, then we can find a way as a church to work together well. I picked up a phrase this week, said this, that it's so easy for pressures from outside the church to become stresses inside the church. And I think it's a wonderful testament when we can have stresses in the world around us, but as we gather together as a church, we can be a church. And I have heard of many churches that have had huge issues over COVID and had big meetings and brought together with their pastor to position that they thought it should be different. And we've been well blessed to not face those kinds of challenges and not to allow the pressures from outside to rip us apart from inside the church. So it's a potluck sermon. So hopefully you'll find one of them this morning that's like really tasty to you. This was the first one, submission. I don't know if it's going to rank as your favorite. We're moving on. The next one is about pride and humility. Perhaps the best example of pride in history is from the Titanic, the ship that could never sink. And for a ship that could never sink, it never made it one time without sinking. It's reported to be repeated. You know, it kind of became a famous one through history. God himself could not sink this ship. And some people said, well, the captain said it. Others said maybe it was others on the ship. It was certainly the atmosphere they had. They had built this thing. It was the biggest, greatest, most engineered thing ever. And it was going to be safe no matter what. And yet we know the story that it didn't work. They sank. And things are sinkable. And you can never say that God can't do it. That you can overpower God. That pride of you will come to you. And you will discover, if you won't humble yourself, that God will humble you. We have a history in the Bible. We believe that it's because of pride why Lucifer was thrown out of heaven. It's the reason why Adam and Eve sinned and were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And it was the key temptation for Jesus when he was tempted by Satan to be tempted. And this week I was sort of focusing in on those related to this idea of pride. But the temptation to Jesus, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. It's an invite and a temptation for pride. This idea, well, I'm Jesus. Like I shouldn't have to suffer. I shouldn't have any kind of difficulty. I should be able to have the good stuff of life because I'm a good person. And this is what the temptation is. Jesus said, if you're proud, you'll give into this. And of course, Jesus resists it. The second temptation. Then the devil took him up on the holy city and had him stand at the highest point of the temple. If you're the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. And this image that, Jesus, you deserve to be honored. Like if you would do that, everyone would recognize just how awesome you are. We all like to have everyone recognize that we're awesome. That we're good. I remember I never really was one who stood out at the crowd, but when I was in grade 12 for basketball, nobody really cared when we played basketball, but we hosted provincials. And all of a sudden for provincials, we had like hundreds of students show up at the Steinbach Regional to watch us play basketball. And for like 2 weeks, I was popular. Like it was just amazing. That everyone was just like, they wanted to know what I thought. What was I thinking? What about the game? And they were really interested. And it was fun. We all enjoy being in charge. We all like having other people admire us. And Satan tempts Jesus and says, don't you want to have everybody acknowledge just how awesome you are? Third one. Again, devil took him up to a very high mount and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus, don't you deserve the power? You're God. You should be in charge. You should have everyone acknowledge just how powerful you are. And Jesus resisted that temptation of pride. Larry Crabb says that in human life, what we desire in life is significance and security. We want to feel like we are important and that we are safe. And it's exactly at these that the devil is tempting on Jesus to say, hey, first of all, that you don't want to suffer, but that others should acknowledge you, that you're significant, and that you should have all the power. You should be in control. You should be able to tell anybody what to do, and it will happen that way. You should have the power, and you will be safe and secure. Pride is one of the greatest enemies, and humility is one of your greatest friends. When you give in to pride, you give in to temptation and into sin, and you will eventually be humbled. D.L. Moody said, "Be humble or you will stumble." And as leaders and as followers, we need to humble ourselves in all of this. He says here that we should clothe ourselves with humility. How often do you wear clothes? Most of us would say that we wear our clothes all the time, especially when it's cold outside. We're not really that tempted not to. And he says, you know what? Every day, put on humility. All day long, whenever you're outside, be humble. Whenever you're at home in your own house, be humble. Even when you're lying in your bed, be humble. Allow that to clothe your life. It's always going to be a little bit external to you. It's always going to be something you need to work at, but just keep on striving to embrace yourself in humility. I was reminded of this image this week of an apple tree. You know, in the springtime, and the flowers. There we go. Yeah, the flowers in the trees blossoms. That's the right word. Yeah, got it. When the blossoms are coming, right, and the tree stands up tall and it shows off all these wonderful things. But when a tree starts to get its fruit, and as the fruit gets heavier and heavier and heavier, it bows down. And your tree in fall time is half as tall because it has humbled itself because of the weight of the blessings that it's had. And that we as people, we should become humble. As we recognize the blessings we have, the more blessings we have, the more humble we should become. All right, second one. Moving on. The third one. Anxiety. Well, we could have made a whole sermon out of this one. It's interesting. I wish that we had more about what he wrote here. What he wrote about anxiety is really valuable, but we have a whole slew of questions that we would like to have. It would be neat if he had taken a whole chapter to expand on this. But what he says here is, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. We have a little bit of a problem. We sometimes wonder and say, well, if I'm going to be humble, if I'm not going to sort of demand that everybody recognize me, they're not going to demand the power, if I'm not going to take that on, then won't people take advantage of me? We have a phrase we say sometimes. We say, the good guys finished last. If you're going to be a good person, you're not going to get ahead in life. And he says to us, you know what? You don't need to worry about this. You don't need to be anxious. You can choose to trust in God, to not demand it for yourself, and allow for the fact that God will take care of you. A week ago, I had a T test, T-E-E. And what they did is they came down, they're still working. At some point, they're going to fix this hole in my heart. But, you know, it's not urgent, so you know how that's working with COVID these days. But I did actually get a test in. And so they take an echocardiogram machine, and they bring it down your throat. Apparently that way they can get a lot better reading off of your receivers because you don't have everything else in the way. And at any rate, they don't quite put you out completely, but you lie down on a chair and they put that stuff into you and you don't remember anything that happens. Except that when you wake up, your throat is very sore. But you choose to put yourself in this place where the doctors knock you out and they do stuff to you. And you do so on the assumption that they're going to do something better for you. They're going to help. And later on when they come for surgery, same thing. They're going to knock you out. They're going to be able to do anything to you. But you do so in the faith that they're going to be helpful and beneficial. And I can't get the benefit of a new surgery without putting myself in the process of giving up control letting the doctor have the power. Jesus chose to do the same thing on the cross. He gave up control. He gave up life. He was trusting that by giving up, that God would bless him to something so much more. And you and I, we need to find ways to not demand to be at the front, to get our own stuff, and to say, you know what, we're going to leave this with God. We're going to take our worries and our concerns and we're going to give them over to God, and we're going to trust that God will take care of it and that God will bring back to us things better than what they are. I was reminded of these verses from Micah chapter 6. Guidance for life. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Walking humbly with your God. Not demanding that you get it, just saying, okay, God, we're gonna give it over to you, and we're going to trust that you will work this out. We don't need to live for others' affirmations. We can wait for God's exaltation. Don't live for others' affirmation. Wait for God's exaltation. And this is what Jesus did with the temptation, in his time of tempting. He didn't need to get control of all those things, because in the end, God gave him all those temptations he had and so much more. But he had to wait. He had to trust. And he needed to wait to see when God would bring those things to be true. We have a word here in verse 7. We have translated it in some places as anxiety. The NLT calls it worries. The King James called it cares. What that Greek word is actually a literal word to say that you are divided and split apart, factored, divided. Yeah, well, like a church, we're divided today. And that the whole party has been split apart. And when we go through times of anxiety, that's what happens to us in our bodies and in our minds, is we get like divided, ripped against ourselves, divided up. And that Jesus said, such a person is double-minded and unstable to all that they do. And he says, cast your care, and God will care. Either you're going to hold on to your troubles of life, or you're going to throw it over to Jesus and let him take care of it. And that's a helpful thought in our mind, because when we think about it that way, we say, well, obviously, the bigger a problem is, the more important it is that I give it over to Jesus. Because on the really important ones, I want Jesus to be in charge of determining the result instead of me. 4 themes this morning. We've been through 3 of them. The devil. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the devil. I remember about 10 years ago, I was in a church and I pastored through our statement of faith. So what we believe in. And it was interesting because we had one of the sections of it was about the devil. And I ended up preaching a whole sermon on the devil. It felt really weird, like awkward. Like, I don't know if we should really be talking about the devil that much in church. Like, occasionally, once in a while, but like to just focus. I found it really strange. I think it was good, but challenging. But he's here to say that the devil is something we need to focus on and be aware of. Maybe not focus on, that's about the best word. It's real. The devil's real. And he is at work. And we need to be aware of this. He says here that we should be alert and sober. Obviously, whenever there's a danger, we always say that you should be alert. I noticed that when I went in for my surgery, they made a point, well, not for my testing, then they said to me, like, for a day, don't make any major decisions. You shouldn't make any major decisions in the first day afterwards because you're under the effect of the drugs from that, and you're not making the best decisions. And when you're making really important decisions, you shouldn't, have 5 beers first because it's not going to be helpful. When there's danger, when there's importance, you need to be sober. You need to be alert. Because the devil is real. He says here that the devil is like a roaring lion. Cats often don't look all that dangerous. But it's interesting how many people die of lions in the zoo. I remember about 10 years ago they had in the Calgary Zoo, somebody came by, they had a security guard, his buddy, they let him in, they brought a ladder with them, this is really smart, and there's 2 rows, there's 6 feet of, there's bars, and then there's 6 feet of gap, and then another one. Anyways, they climbed over the first one because they wanted to be able to pet the lions. And as you might imagine, didn't turn out that well for them. I don't think they died, if I recall correctly, but people get mauled in by lions all the time and get killed, even in zoos, because they look so safe. A cat looks like lazy. We have in my family, we have a cat, and she is the most gentle cat. She's lazy. Mostly what she loves to do is just sit on the shelf in the sunshine and just sit there all day long. And if you let her outside, what she loves to do is to go outside and lie down in the shade right underneath where the bird feeder is. And they lie there, she lies there for hours, just gentle, calm. All you can see is her tail's going back and forth. I've never actually seen what happens next because I'm never watching. I only see what happens. But she'll lie there and you just kind of forget about her. It's not that important. And all of a sudden she will go exploding up into the air. And well over half the time, a bird dies. She's the most gentlest cat we've ever had. Lazy. But she's also a murderous killer. And when the birds perceive that cat as being not a threat, they are being foolish. And it costs them their lives. And the devil is around us. There's some churches and some Christians who don't believe that the devil is real. He's real. We tend not to fall into that error. We say, yes, we acknowledge the devil's real, but the fact of the matter is we get lured off into not realizing it. I have a question for you. When in the last month have you thought to yourself, I think this was the devil at work in this? The thing is that we recognize that, yes, the devil's at work, but we don't actually see ever when he is. And that by who we are, we treat him like he doesn't exist because we don't see him. The devil is working. It takes some deception, takes the opposite of deception, discerning. Takes some discerning to spot out what the devil's doing, but the devil's at work. He's mulling in your life, in your marriage, in your family, and he is out to do destruction in the world. And we need to be aware of it and recognize it and not be lured off to sleep, but recognize, Satan is actually at work in this. And he's causing troubles. And we don't need to be afraid of this, because God is more powerful than the devil. But we cannot be put asleep. We need to be aware. It's interesting, he says here that we should be alert, that we should not be drunk. And the second thing he says is that we should resist and we should stand firm. The devil, one of his great temptations is to convince us by fear to change. As Christians, he can't make you change. But if he can trick you, if you out of fear change, then he can cause you to change. And so you need to resist. You need to stand firm. God is victorious over the devil. Jesus has defeated every demon. But we need to be aware that he is there. He is active. It is a challenge. This is a battle. And that we need to be alert and we need to resist against the work of the devil. So this morning, 4 different themes. They don't fit together. Usually when we preach a sermon, we say, well, we try to have one theme. Well, we got 4 this morning. And I trust that one of these will catch a hold of you. In a good potluck, you don't need every single one to turn out great. As long as you find, 2 or 3 that are real good ones that you go back for seconds on. I'm trying to have not too much the first time through so that I can go back to some of those real good ones. And this morning's a little bit in that category too. Find one of these and delve into it a little bit more. Why don't we pray? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you for 1 Peter in this chapter we've been on, and there's just so much truth for us. I pray, Lord, that we would hear your word. God, we are a church that is seeking to be faithful to you, to follow you, to learn from you, to encourage each other, to serve you together. And I pray, Lord, that you would bless us as we seek to be faithful. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Do we have a closing song? No, we do not. All right, so thank you all for coming. Yes, the rest of you want to come by and vote, whether the north side or south side, which one's rules. The north side won this week, but any of you online who want to come in, come join me. The south side won, pardon me. But anyways, if you come join my side on the north side, I need a few more volunteers to even it out. But it's good. Fun, we can make fun of it at least, and we do that. May God bless you and keep you. Amen.